just to welcome Simon Smith, who the Assistant Director from CI Consultancy, who's going to take us through the self-financing HRA.
Chartered Institute of Housing, yeah?
That's correct.
Yes, that's it, so it's going to take us through the 30-year business plan. We've actually been working with Simon as part of the leadership team, really to make sense of some of the challenges of the self-financing HRA. Secondly, we've been monitoring the implication of the business plan through the Housing Programs Management Board I chair. And it's really a good opportunity, Chairman, for Simon to share with you some of the thinking that we've been having on the business plan. At the same time, set out some of the implication when we come to the asset management strategy. So Simon's got about 20 minutes or so to take you through the presentation. Thank you, Chairman.
Would members mind if I stand while I do the presentation? And secondly, could I check that you can hear me as well?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Yes, we've been working with yourself since around about the beginning of 2010, when the idea around that self-financing within the housing revenue account was mooted. And this, of course, this self-financing means that the business plan for a local authority has taken on a completely different dimension in terms that you can actually start to forecast forward exactly what you would like to do with your housing stock by knowing what resources are actually available. Very quickly, there's a snapshot on top of the screen there which identifies some of the work which we did since the last time which we updated the business plan, which may or may not have got to yourselves. But that kind of gives you a record there. What I'd like to say is, in the 20-minute slot which I have now, is if you've got any questions as we're going along, please do interject. And then if we're doing it that way, rather than do some questions at the end, if that's okay with yourself. Fine, okay. Very shortly, well, you would have seen already in your committee papers the budgets which are being proposed for next year, but also for this year as well. Now, these form an important foundation in terms of the financial modelling which we have done, whereby what we do is we have a look in terms of how the HRA is performing, both in terms of its income, but also as well as its expenditure as well. And obviously one key note is you'll see that the revenue repairs expenditure here increases significantly next year. And the idea is to demonstrate what the impact on the business plan that is, but also as well what we're forecasting forward in the future. Okay. We also have some other lines in there whereby the capital contribution, this is where the day-to-day housing revenue account makes a contribution from its revenue position over to form for capital works. And again, I'm going to cover the capital position in 1 second. So what you'll generally note is that there are some marginal increases due to inflation for the rent increase, which you'll be discussing later on. Increases in terms of the service charges, which recognise the recharges that will go to your leaseholders for the repairs that will be done. Now, these types of repairs are going to be more around about improvements in terms of the blocks, more of a short-term nature rather than of the capital nature. And again, that will be something that will be discussed through your asset management strategy, but also as well the budget process. You also make a small contribution to the loan repayment. You pay a very small amount in terms of interest, in terms of the loans which you have on the housing revenue account, and that's because you've pretty much got one of the lowest loan balances throughout the country in terms of self-financing. And I think that was just a recognition, obviously, of the type of stock and the management issues which you face in terms of providing services for your tenants. So this is the capital position. So we've looked at the day-to-day position. This is now the capital position, most certainly in the short term, whereby this year you should be spending just short of £7.5 million. And that's funded through what's called the Major Repairs Reserve, which is the mechanism which we move the money from the revenue account over to the capital account. There's contributions which come from your section 106 contributions there, and of course money which comes back from leaseholders as well. So the important note is that the capital expenditure which you see there, and that will be discussed later on, can be fully funded without any issues. Moving forward though, of course, is a business plan. Certainly the modelling which we've undertaken covers over a 30-year period, and this is, if you like, almost covered as an industry standard. But what we have to do is we have to make assumptions in terms of what's going to change over that 30-year period. Now, one of the things, of course, is around about debt position. I've taken the view here that I'm looking to show in terms of a viability as to how quickly you could repay that loan position which you've got, which currently stands at £10.6 million. Also as well, one factor we need to do is to see where we're going to change in terms of new properties, in terms of the right to buy implications which you currently have, whereby obviously with the generous discounts which are available, you're seeing a higher number of right to buy sales which are flowing through at the moment. So obviously we've had to take a view whereby what's going to happen in terms of changes in terms of stock, but also as well of course recently the stock which you've taken on board as well through your new build programmes. We have to take assumptions around about inflation as well, and generally what we've done is we've taken the government's target of 2.5%, which is more typical than their retail price index, which if you like is slightly higher than the CPI, which perhaps is preferred. This gives a form of contingency or a prudency within your plan, so I'm very comfortable in terms of what we've done there. In terms of interest rates as well, currently you have an incredibly low interest rate based on the agreements which you have internally for those loans, and even if they were to increase significantly, so for example if you were to take market loans in the future, your plan is still extremely viable, and I'll give you some examples of that later on. Rents, you'll be discussing the rent increase next year. It's being modelled at the moment with a 3.2% rent increase, and then in future years we're looking to follow the government policy, which is CPI plus 1%, so we've modelled on a 3% basis there as well. So in terms when we're looking in terms of your rental income moving by 3% moving forward, but generally your costs going up by 2.5%. And certainly that's very much in line with the business plans which we've been modelling elsewhere. In terms of arrears and bad debts, we obviously have to make provisions for void, whereby obviously the property is empty whilst you have the turnover, but also as well we've had to make a provision for bad debts as well. And we've taken a bit of a cautious approach in terms of welfare reform, whilst already you've seen the effects of the spare room subsidy, the overall benefits cap and increases in non-dependent deductions. Once the universal credit system takes full effect, whereby tenants will be paying their rent directly to yourselves rather than actually the benefit coming directly to you, there obviously could be risks whereby around about income protection for a short period of time. So what we've done is we've made a provision within the plan that reflects that. Repair costs, as you've seen from the previous chart, they increased to just over £9 million for next year, and then what we've then done is we've reduced them back to just shy of £4.5 million moving forward. Now when I say repair costs, these are your day-to-day voids and generally sort of cyclical works, not the capital maintenance, which we'll be discussing very shortly. Okay, if there were to be issues in the future around about inflation, then obviously what you would have to do is to look to make efficiencies within the service if your plan wasn't deemed to be viable. But to be honest, with what I've seen so far, there are no issues, and I'll explain that again later on. There is also money available through right to buy receipts, and I've got a slide on that later on as well in terms of what we need to consider moving forward on that. Now you'll be shortly hearing around about your asset management strategy. For me, it's important in terms of the modelling, I need to understand how much money needs to be invested in your stock over the next 20 years. And what you see here is effectively an extract from your asset management strategy, or if you like, an investment standard which needs to be spent on your stock over the next 30 years. And you'll see we're recognising the high levels of expenditure which you've got now, which reflects the black funding, if you like, in terms of the works which you've had to do from the previous days under the housing subsidy system when there wasn't so much resource available. But typically what you'll see then is that the demands on your stock are in and around about the £4 to £3 million mark moving forward. There's no serious peaks in there moving forward. One thing which I like to do is to benchmark is how much money is being invested in stock per unit over a 30-year period. And this works out at around about £43,820, which is very much in line with the benchmarks which I would expect for your stock. So whilst you're not putting jacuzzis and gold taps within your stock, what you are doing is effectively keeping your stock effectively at a modern and a reasonable standard. Okay, so there's certainly, if you like, the right amount of money running through the plan for investing in your stock forward. Of course, there's no inflation in there, and also as well, I haven't included any future provision for new build in there as well. So this is, if you like, a status quo or a base position. This next chart now comes out from the business plan model, which shows me exactly what the expenditure profile is going to be in future years. So in terms of this includes inflation. And the most important thing is this blue line which runs along the top. That basically dictates that there is enough money within the business plan to fund the capital works which are in there. So there is absolutely no issue in terms of your HRA being projected forward in not being able to meet that standard which I just identified earlier on. So that £42,000 per unit can be afforded. And again, I stress that there's no new build which we've included within the costs. Okay. So for me though, one key thing is to actually identify what happens with the debt which you are currently covering. And as the earlier slide said, is you've currently got £10.6 million worth of debt, which is probably one of the lowest within the 160 stockholding authorities across the country. Hence why your interest charges are so low, plus the benefit which you have as well from your internal borrowing mechanism. So, for me, in terms of testing how viable your business plan is, I look to see how quickly you could repay your debt. And this is what's come out from the modelling. Very quickly, because of the high level of expenditure which you've got for year 2 and a bit of flow on in year 3, we can then see that the plan can very quickly afford to repay that 10 or so million pounds worth of debt. Now, you don't have to do this. This is nothing which is laid out in statute. This is just purely and utterly a viability position. Generally, at the moment, what you have is a process whereby you will be gradually reducing that loan position on a 2% reducing balance, which is something which some authorities have followed across the country. There's no right or absolutely no wrong way, but certainly at the moment there are many, if not every single housing association in the country would love to have a debt figure like that, certainly with the number of stock which you're carrying at the moment. So I certainly would not be saying for 1 second that this level of debt causes you any problems. If I'm being honest, and I've worked with up to 70 authorities working with self-financing, probably about the best performing, or perhaps around about the average performing local authorities could repay their debt within the periods of between 18 to 21 years. So this gives you an idea that you have an incredible and very viable business plan. What this does is it gives you the scope for you to think about obviously future investment in your stock, new build, and such like. I also have to point out as well that there is a government imposed debt cap, that when self-financing was taken out, every authority was given a limit of indebtedness, and yours is at 25 million, with your loans being at the end of next financial year around the £10 million mark. You do have borrowing capacity of around about £15 million. And again, there are probably around about 40 to 45 local authorities in the country that again would love to have that borrowing power, but do not have at all. So again, that puts you very much in a good position whereby you can show that over a relatively short period of time you could afford to repay those loans if you wanted to, but at the same time you've actually got the capacity or the ability to borrow more money. So if we've shown that you can meet... Sorry.
Question.
Sorry, I was just going to ask about the debt cap. It sounded like that was fixed, so it's not relative to your sort of asset value, and it just stays the same, even if the value of your assets increase, or...
It's exactly that. As an institute, we've actually been pushing since self-financing happened to say that this is an unfair restriction, if you like, for local authorities. The idea was, I think that when self-financing happened, there was a net take-on of debt for local authority housing of around about £7 billion. And of course, this was in a period whereby we were actually looking to restrain public borrowing. Certainly the government was at that period. So therefore, what they wanted to do was to put a cap on it. Now that cap, as it stands, is forecast to stay for that period over the whole 30 years. As I said, as an institute, we've been pushing to try and get that limit increased. Because whilst you have the ability at the moment to borrow £15 million, there's many local authorities out there that cannot borrow anymore. They are at their debt cap already, yet they have the resources through the rental income that's coming through to be able to easily afford to borrow more money. But there is a restriction at the moment that government that's hauled in. There may be one or two reasons whereby the government feel the need to do that. I think there's a lot of concern out there, if I'm being honest. It hasn't helped as well that there are some authorities out there that haven't moved or taken any of their headroom, or if you like, the borrowing headroom which they have there currently. But there's reasons behind that, and I can sort of demonstrate to you later on when we move through, when we start doing some new build modelling, that there are reasons why local authorities haven't borrowed so far. That's purely and utterly, it's a case of they've been working within this restrained cash environment in the past, and the idea now, of course, is with self-financing, that's released additional monies to them. And what they're doing is they're planning properly in terms of what they're going to invest their money in. So they're not rushing out and borrowing the money straight away. And I think that has now been acknowledged by the government. But unfortunately, they are standing very firm that they don't wish that debt cap to be moved. However, there could be a change of government next year, and that could be repealed. We don't know at the moment. But I would certainly expect that, certainly as an institute, we are going to be pushing certainly for something like that to be moved. You're absolutely right with that observation, that there should be a recognition that as time moves on with cost price inflation and such like that, there should be an increase which is in there. But at the moment, that's what we've been told that we will have to work within the compliance of. So, in the position whereby you can meet all your capital expenditure, and at the same time I've demonstrated that the 10 or so million pounds worth of debt which you currently have could be repaid over an 8-year period, what happens then, of course, is that your balances would then start building up to an incredibly healthy position over that period of time. Now, obviously, that's based on just investing in the stock condition survey, which you've just seen now. No new build, keeping a minimum balance of £1 million, by the way, so even though you see that red line coming incredibly low to the zero mark, there is actually a buffer there of £1 million within the modelling. So that does present that, first, if you didn't want to repay that £10 million over that period of time, you would have that resource available to you now. And secondly, of course, what happens from year 8 is with the additional rental income that's coming in, slight reduction in terms of your stock investment, you start seeing some balances which will build up onto your HRA. And whilst that might look extremely appealing of being £98 million or so in 30 years' time, the reality is that's more like around about 38 or 40 million pounds in today's money moving forward. But at least again, that's a very, very promising position, and certainly gives you food for thought when you look forward to thinking about future investment plans for your stock. I want to talk very quickly around about right to buy receipts, because this is something that's causing a lot of problems within authorities, whereby there's a significant number of sales which are running through. Just very quickly to summarise within this slide here, is that there are various mechanisms which take money away from that initial receipt from what you have from your right to buy sales. The most important one is this segment which you see here, and this is something called a 1-for-1 receipt, whereby if you remember when there was a reinvigoration in right to buy, the government promoted the view that they felt that there should be a 1-for-1 replacement in terms of homes. So in other words, across the nation, for every home that was sold, there should be sufficient money made available to be able to provide a new home. What in fact that means is that the money that is actually left for reinvestment goes towards 30% of the cost of a new home. So what happens is it doesn't mean that the sale which you get from a right to buy sale provides enough money to build a new home. What happens is once it's gone through the various mechanisms, you should only have around about 30% left in which to be able to provide a new home, which means you have to provide the 70%. So very quickly, this is a chart which shows exactly what's happened to your right to buy receipts since the introduction of the system. It took a while, obviously, with people with the greater number of discounts that were available before you started getting to the position whereby there were receipts that you were retaining for reinvestment under the 1-for-1. But you can see here now that that position is built up. The position was around about £1.6 million. Now that means that you have to spend that money within a 3-year period from when it accrues. And you can see that I've got a chart there, or a column there, that lays out that, say, from that £19,000 that was banked in the 1-for-1 reserve in March, you have to have spent that, and that was in March, by the way, 2013. You would have had to have spent £64,000 by March 2016. Okay? But very quickly, as the receipts start accumulating, which they have done, and obviously these are what you have banked already, by the way, these are receipts up to September 2014, you can see that you will have actually needed to spend £6.7 million on new build. Now currently you don't have plans for that so far, but as I've demonstrated, you've got an incredibly viable business plan. So if we factor in you spending £6.7 million on new build, with of course the money which you've got banked already in terms of the 1-for-1 going towards those, this effectively is the position of your business plan. So you can see that in the short term, because bearing in mind you've got a time constraint when you've got to spend that £6 or so million, you would have had to have borrowed up to the point by year 4. And then what happens is originally my debt graph showed you being able to repay your loan by year 8. By having to do that new build, by using up that receipt, you would actually repay your loans by, say, year 11. So does it have a big impact on your business plan? The answer is no. It just means that you've got to borrow some money, but the good news is, of course, is that you've got to spend £6.7 million on new build. And of course, officers are out there already looking at potential sites whereby that money that can be spent, and I'm sure those plans will be coming to yourselves very, very shortly. In terms of the impact over your overall cash balance again, yes, it obviously falls a little bit short than the £98 million which was projected in the base position which was there earlier on. Very quickly, going back to this slide here, is if you're unable to spend the money which you've taken here today, unfortunately, if the government take that money back, they will charge you interest at 4% above the base rate, compounded. So it's not one thing which I would advise you handing back. Secondly, you can give it to any of your local housing providers as well, but I'm absolutely sure you would rather be spending the money yourselves than actually providing the new homes yourselves there. So just to basically summarise, your business plan is incredibly robust. If I'm being honest, it's probably in the top 3 which I've seen in the 70 on them which I've been dealing with so far. Okay, it gives you lots of opportunities in terms of moving forward. It's showing that it's sustainable in terms of the investment standard which you've got identified so far as part of your asset management strategy. But at least what it can do is give you the comfort that you can start thinking beyond that position. And you can take some time as well in terms of actually developing the options that you might think. Generally, as I say, every authority across the country has actually benefited from self-financing, but certainly yourselves particularly. And you're doing exactly the right thing now that, of course, authorities are thinking around about their asset management strategies, and you've got all those things being brought for you today there as well. So that's pretty much the position sort of summarised at the moment. So I know it's only been a 20-minute session, but hopefully that's given you some comfort in terms of your business plan, and I've been able to give you a bit of a national perspective in terms as well in how you sit. Okay. Is there any other further questions?
Very much. Anybody got any How are you studying?
Chairman, just a reassurance that we're not planning to give the money to other places or pay any interest back to central government. What we do have is actually our strategy which sets out the development that we've actually got, including, for example, the Richard Clousley development that came to your committee. And on top of that, in terms of our strategic thinking, we've actually got some of the projects that we're currently formulating that will come back to your committee as well, Chairman.
It just sounds like there's quite a lot of headroom for us to be more ambitious, and in the context of London's housing shortage, I just wonder whether that's something that's being considered.
Yeah, do you want to?
Absolutely. We obviously playing our role to ensure that we contribute to meeting the challenge in terms of London housing. One of the key developments, bearing in mind the position of the city, where we don't have the land is really for us to think strategically about this. So one example, of course, is actually the work on the Richard Closet site with Islington Council. Without going into any detail, we've actually got 3 other partnerships that we're currently working through that will come back to your committee in terms of our own attempt to contribute to resolving some of the challenges in terms of housing in London.
Great, thank you. Simon, thanks very much. I'm sure we all feel very invigorated with the possibilities we have before us. And just to say, as we're a subcommittee, we don't need to stand up when we speak.